I didn't expect the words to sting as they did. My son didn't yell them in anger. He whispered them, quietly, almost politely. As if it were a fact, not an insult. "Mom. I'm ashamed of you." And in that moment, standing outside his school gates, surrounded by polished cars and parents in suits, I realized my son didn't know me at all. But that was about to change. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything, but first, if you enjoy stories like this, you want to be part of the 10% viewers who click on the like button. It makes us really happy. If you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly support us today by subscribing to this channel. This helps us to bring you more beautiful stories. It will be great to tell us where you are watching us from in the comment section. Now let's get into the details of the story. I always believed I understood the weight of silence, but that day, outside the school gates, I learned how a whisper could carry more force than a shout. I stood there waiting with my hands tucked into the pockets of my worn jacket, watching other parents arrive in fancy SUVs or polished sedans, stepping out in crisp suits and dresses that probably cost more than a month's salary of mine. I didn't feel lesser than them. At least, not until I saw my son, Ethan, walking toward me with a stiffness in his shoulders and embarrassment painted across his face. It was Parent Appreciation Day, and I thought showing up would mean something, some acknowledgement, however small, for the years I had spent sacrificing sleep, pride, and dreams to make sure he had what he needed. Instead, his eyes darted around nervously, as though he was searching for a way to detach himself from me. When he leaned in and whispered that he was ashamed, the words felt like a cold knife sliding between my ribs, delivered quietly enough that only I could hear, but sharp enough to echo in my mind long after we walked away from the crowd. As I stood there frozen, the laughter of nearby students rang out, not intentionally at me, but it didn't need to be. I knew what they saw when they looked my way. A bus driver in a faded uniform, a tired man with calloused hands, someone they assumed had reached the ceiling of life. But what stunned me wasn't the judgment of children, it was how easily my own son absorbed that judgment and turned it inward on me. I wanted to tell him right then that I wasn't ashamed of who I was, that my job was honest work, and that every long shift behind the wheel was a choice I made to give him a chance at something better. I wanted to remind him of the nights I came home exhausted yet still helped him study, or the mornings I woke up before dawn to drive other people's children safely to school so I could be home when he returned. Yet I said nothing. I swallowed the pain, nodded quietly, and watched him walk away without once meeting my eyes. Driving home that afternoon was one of the longest rides of my life, not because of traffic but because of the thoughts crowding my mind. I replayed the moment again and again, trying to understand where I went wrong, wondering if I had failed as a father by shielding him too much from the hardships we faced. I had always thought love alone was enough, that showing up mattered more than showing off. I believed that being present in his life, attending every game, meeting every teacher, and cooking dinner every night compensated for the absence of luxury or prestige. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe in trying to give him stability, I also gave him ignorance about what it cost to provide that stability. The house we lived in wasn't big, but it was paid for. The meals on our table weren't fancy, but they were earned with sweat, not charity. The bus I drove wasn't glamorous, but it supported our entire life. The problem was, he saw only the surface, a simple man with a simple job. He didn't know what stood behind those choices, and that misunderstanding burned deeper than I expected. When I arrived home, I sat in the driver's seat of the parked bus long after the engine had gone silent. I stared at my own reflection in the rearview mirror and tried to see myself the way Ethan saw me. I didn't see shame, I saw a man who had traded ambition for responsibility, pride for reliability, and dreams for fatherhood. But I also realized that my son didn't know any of that because I never really told him. I assumed he understood, that he could sense the sacrifices I made just by living with me. I assumed that children recognized dedication without needing explanations. But children don't see sacrifice, they see outcomes. And if those outcomes don't glitter like gold, the world teaches them to judge. That night, I made a decision, not to punish him, not to guilt-trip him, but to show him, calmly and undeniably, who I truly was and what I stood for. I wouldn't lecture him with words that would fade. I would let him see the truth for himself. Because sometimes, the only way to mend a broken perception is to reveal the pieces that were never visible before. And I knew then that this quiet whisper of shame would become the I spent the next few days thinking about the distance between the life my son imagined I lived and the life I actually lived, and the more I reflected on it, the clearer it became that Ethan only knew the surface of our story. He saw the bus I drove every morning, the uniform I washed and hung on the line each evening, and the paycheck that came regularly but wasn't large enough to create the kind of lifestyle some of his classmates enjoyed. What he didn't see were the opportunities one turned down for his sake, or the long hours I spent helping others in the community because I believed that kindness mattered as much as accomplishment. I remembered nights when the neighborhood kids gathered in our living room for homework sessions because their parents worked late or couldn't afford tutors. I recalled weekends spent volunteering at the community center where I organized after-school programs to keep children engaged and safe. None of this was visible to Ethan because I never spoke about it, I didn't brag or explain. I assumed he understood that humanity and success weren't mutually exclusive. Now I realized assuming was a mistake. Parents often hope children will notice sacrifices on their own, but children don't measure devotion the same way adults do. They measure what they see, and what they saw in my case was a man who arrived home tired, covered in dust from the road, with a salary that didn't reflect the depth of effort or intention behind the life he built. The truth was that my path hadn't always been lined with bus routes and early mornings. Before I became a driver, I worked as a junior engineer at a construction firm, a job that required long days and even longer nights. I was good at it, and my supervisors recognized my dedication. Promotions were within reach, and stability seemed assured. But when Ethan's mother fell ill, everything shifted. I was faced with a choice between climbing a corporate ladder that demanded most of my time and being physically present for my family. My wife needed care, attention, and comfort, and my son needed stability and reassurance. I weighed the options, listened to countless well-meaning colleagues tell me I was sabotaging my future, and ultimately chose family over advancement. I resigned from the firm not out of lack of ambition, but out of love. I took a job as a driver because it allowed flexible hours and guaranteed I could care for both of them. It wasn't an easy transition. I traded tailored shirts for uniform jackets, project presentations for route schedules, and business meetings for engine checks. Yet, in those moments when I held my wife's hand during her hardest days or read bedtime stories to my son instead of arriving home past midnight, I believed I made the right decision. Ethan never saw the crossroads that shaped our future, he only saw the outcome. Even after my wife passed, I never returned to engineering. Not because I lacked the ability, but because I realized something during those difficult months: being present was more valuable than being impressive. I witnessed firsthand how fragile life could be and how quickly moments could slip away. I decided I didn't want a childhood full of photographs where I was absent, replaced by trophies and salaries that couldn't hug or listen. Instead, I chose early mornings so I could be home by afternoon, chose modest wages so I could sit in the front row of every school play, and chose to be the parent my son could rely on. The world often measures success by wealth and appearances, but I measured success by dinners eaten together, late-night conversations, and a home that echoed with laughter. I wanted Ethan to grow up knowing compassion, not competition, humility, not arrogance. I wanted him to understand that character wasn't built by money alone. But somewhere along the way, the world's voice grew louder than mine. He began to associate prestige with worth and luxury with value, forgetting the quiet victories we lived daily. I realized then that my silence had contributed to his ignorance. I thought storytelling my sacrifices would make me seem self-congratulatory or burdensome, so I stayed quiet. I never explained how I budgeted carefully to pay for his extracurricular activities without letting him feel the strain. I never told him how I rejected a return offer from my old firm because the hours they required would take me away from him again. I never mentioned that the small house we lived in was bought with savings accumulated over years, allowing us to remain debt-free while giving him security. My intention was never to hide the truth. It was simply to protect him from worrying about things children shouldn't carry. Now, I understood that sheltering him had unintended consequences. He grew up seeing results, not sacrifices, routine, not resilience. He saw a driver, not a father who chose family over ambition. And as much as his words hurt, they forced me to face the reality that love isn't always visible unless it's explained. That was when I knew, I had to show him, not just tell him, what my life truly represented. When the weekend arrived, I didn't wake up with anger or resentment burning in my chest. Instead, I felt a steady resolve, a quiet determination to bridge the gap that had formed between my son and me. I knew I couldn't simply sit him down and list my sacrifices or recite the reasons behind my choices. Lectures rarely change hearts. What changes them is experience, exposure, and the realization that empathy is learned, not inherited. So, I knocked on his bedroom door early that Saturday morning and asked him to spend the day with me. He raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting chores or awkward conversations, but something in my calm tone must have softened his resistance because he reluctantly agreed. As I drove, he stared out the window, earbuds tucked in, wearing the same detached expression he'd worn outside the school gates. Yet, beneath the silence, I sensed a curiosity simmering. He wanted to know why I insisted he come. That curiosity was the first crack in the wall between us, and I was determined to widen it until understanding poured through. We didn't head toward a mall or restaurant like his friends might with their parents. Instead, I drove toward the older part of town, where our neighborhood community center stood, weathered but welcoming. The moment we walked through the double doors, something shifted. Children ran toward me with smiles so bright, voices so warm, and arms so eager to hug, that Ethan's confusion became visible. The respect, admiration, and affection I received inside that building stood in sharp contrast to the judgment he imagined defined my life. I introduced him to teachers, volunteers, and parents whose children I had driven to school, tutored, or supported in ways he'd never known. A mother approached him and explained how I had taken her son to the hospital late one night when she couldn't get off work. Another father recounted how my weekend reading program helped his daughter catch up in school. Ethan's posture changed, shoulders straightening, eyes widening, not dramatically, but subtly, the way realization often begins. He observed, quietly, the impact of small actions, the depth of relationships built on kindness rather than status. It was the first time he saw me not as a man defined by a job, but as someone valued by a community. I didn't speak much during those interactions. I let others do the talking because I wanted him to hear unbiased truths, not what he might mistake for self-praise. In those conversations, he saw pieces of my life that I had never shown him, not because I wanted a medal, but because helping others shouldn't require recognition. After we left the community center, I didn't take him home. Instead, we drove to the bus depot. His reaction was immediate, a mix of discomfort and defensiveness. He assumed I wanted him to help clean or repair buses as some sort of punishment or moral lesson. But that wasn't my goal. I wanted him to witness the camaraderie, the dedication, and the unseen responsibilities that defined my work. Inside the depot, mechanics greeted me with friendly nods, dispatchers waved, and fellow drivers joked about routes and passengers. I introduced him to colleagues who spoke not about steering wheels and engines, but about lives changed by our roles, children who depended on the bus to reach school, elderly passengers who trusted us to get them safely to medical appointments, and the responsibility of ensuring safety even when our passengers didn't appreciate or acknowledge us. I watched Ethan absorb these conversations with silent contemplation. He began to grasp that being a bus driver wasn't simply a job. It was a duty requiring patience, skill, and diligence. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honorable. What struck him most wasn't what I said but what others said about me: reliable, trustworthy, patient, committed. Words he didn't associate with embarrassment or shame. I could see his mind turning, weighing new information against old judgments. He wasn't ready to apologize yet, but he was beginning to understand the complexity of my life. We ended the day at a quiet cafe, a simple spot where I often stopped between shifts. He sat across from me, unusually silent, not the annoyed silence of earlier, but a reflective one. I didn't pressure him to speak. Instead, I shared stories I had never told him before. I told him about driving through storms, comforting scared children, helping stranded passengers, and the nights I chose to stay late so someone else could go home to their family. I explained that kindness isn't always visible, and success doesn't always wear a suit. I also admitted my mistakes, not telling him enough, not showing him the fullness of my life, and assuming he understood values I never explained. The vulnerability in that admission seemed to soften something in him. Though he didn't apologize, he asked his first genuine question: "Why didn't you tell me?" It wasn't confrontational, it was curious, almost regretful. In that moment, I saw the first glimmer of understanding, the beginning of a shift from embarrassment to awareness. The lesson wasn't over, far from it, but the foundation had been laid. And I knew that soon, he would see the most significant truth of all, that sacrifice isn't weakness, and humility isn't shame. They are choices, and often, the noblest ones. Catalyst for a lesson neither of us would ever forget. When Ethan finally asked me why I never told him the truth about my past or the sacrifices I made, the question lingered in the air like a fragile glass object, delicate, important, and easy to mishandle. I looked at him across the small table in that quiet cafe, and I knew the answer wasn't simple. I told him I didn't speak about my sacrifices because I didn't want him to grow up believing love was something that needed acknowledgement to be real. I wanted him to enjoy his childhood without feeling guilty every time I canceled a night shift so I could attend his school play or turned down extra hours so I could help him with homework. I wanted him to believe stability was natural, not purchased with long hours or lost opportunities. I explained that I'd kept silent because I believed actions should speak for themselves, and I didn't want him to measure love by grand gestures or financial success. Yet, as I spoke, I realized there was more to it. I had also kept silent because a part of me feared that telling him about my past ambitions would only highlight how much I'd given up. I didn't want him to see me as someone who surrendered dreams. I wanted him to see me as someone who chose family over ambition. But silence has a cost, and the cost in our case was misunderstanding. He didn't know the intentions behind my choices because I never voiced them, and I carried the burden of that communication gap. I continued by sharing the hardest chapter of my life, his mother's illness. I described the day I walked into my supervisor's office, resignation letter trembling in my hand, knowing that I was stepping away from a future many people work their entire lives toward. I told him how I sat beside his mother through chemotherapy sessions, watching the woman I loved fight a battle that drained her strength day by day. I explained how I took over the tasks she could no longer manage, cooking, cleaning, comforting, and how I tried to shield him from the reality of her suffering because he was too young to bear it. I described the night I held her hand for hours as she slept, knowing she didn't have many nights left, and how I whispered promises I wasn't sure I'd be strong enough to keep. Ethan listened without interrupting, and for the first time I saw his eyes soften in a way that told me he was beginning to understand that the life we lived wasn't shaped by lack of ambition but by love and necessity. I told him I didn't regret those choices, even though they changed the direction of my life forever. Because if I had pursued promotions and prestige, I would have missed moments with her that I could never replace, and I would have been absent during the most pivotal time of his life. Then I revealed something I had kept hidden from almost everyone: the job offer I received after her passing. A former colleague reached out when he heard about my situation and offered me an opportunity to return to engineering, with a position that would have paid more than I'd ever earned before. I told Ethan that I sat with that offer for days, weighing the financial security it promised against the time it would take from him. He was only 8 when his mother passed, grieving and confused, and I knew he needed stability more than a bigger paycheck. I didn't accept the offer because I couldn't justify missing his childhood when it had already been scarred by loss. I told him about the nights I lay awake questioning whether I was doing the right thing, struggling with doubts and fears that I hid behind a calm exterior. I explained that sometimes strength doesn't look heroic or dramatic, sometimes strength is simply showing up, day after day, even when the world tells you to pursue something bigger. I watched him absorb this revelation, his expression shifting from disbelief to a quiet, painful realization. Finally, I admitted my deepest fear. That he would see my sacrifices as failures, not choices. I confessed that I stayed silent because I didn't want him to feel responsible for the path I took, nor did I want him to believe his presence in my life cost me success. I told him that love doesn't count losses, it embraces them. And I reassured him that every decision I made was rooted in the belief that family isn't built on wealth or titles, but on time, presence, and unwavering commitment. When I finished speaking, the silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, it was introspective. He didn't rush to apologize, and I didn't expect him to. Understanding takes time and remorse can't be forced. But there was a shift, subtle but undeniable, in the way he looked at me. The embarrassment he once felt began to give way to respect, and though we weren't healed yet, we were no longer drifting apart. For the first time since he whispered those hurtful words at the school gates, I believed we were moving towards something better. The truth, once hidden, was now shared. And sharing it became the first real step toward reconciliation. In the weeks that followed our conversation, I noticed subtle changes in Ethan, nothing dramatic or overly sentimental, but quiet shifts that told me the truth had begun to settle inside him. He started lingering at the dinner table instead of rushing to his room, asking questions about my day rather than offering one-word replies. He no longer winced when I picked him up near the school gates. Instead, he walked toward me with his shoulders squared, acknowledging me openly in front of his classmates. The first time he waved at me with his friends watching, I was caught off guard. It was a small gesture, perhaps insignificant to an outsider, but to me it signaled a bridge being rebuilt, not with grand apologies or dramatic speeches, but with daily respect. I realized then that change, especially in a young heart battling peer pressure and insecurity, is rarely instantaneous. It's gradual, almost imperceptible at first, until one day you wake up and notice the distance between you shrinking. And although he had not yet verbalized remorse, I could sense it forming inside him, unspoken but sincere. Then came career day at his school, a day I had quietly dreaded for years, because it was the place where children showcased their parents' accomplishments, and pride or shame often bloomed in equal measure. When Ethan asked me to attend, I paused, unsure whether he was inviting me out of obligation or genuine intention. But his steady gaze held no trace of the embarrassment he once displayed. When I walked into the school that morning, memories of the whisper that once cut me deeply resurfaced, but this time they carried less sting, replaced by the knowledge that he now understood the weight of that moment. Parents filled the room, doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs, dressed in polished attire. I wore my clean uniform, not because I felt compelled to, but because it represented who I was with honesty. When the teacher invited me to speak, I didn't talk about sacrifice or hardship. I talked about responsibility, integrity, and the importance of seeing dignity beyond appearances. I spoke about the laughter of children on morning rides, the elderly passengers who trusted me with their journeys, and the satisfaction of knowing that every day, I contributed to the functioning of the community. I didn't embellish or dramatize. I simply told the truth of my work. When I finished, I sat down, ready for polite applause and nothing more. But instead, I felt a hand on my shoulder, my son's. He stood before his classmates, not with hesitation but with conviction, and spoke words I never imagined hearing. He said he used to misunderstand what success meant, believing it was measured by money and status, and that he once felt ashamed because he judged without understanding. He said learning the truth changed him. He introduced me not as a bus driver, but as his father, the man who chose family over career, presence over prestige, and kindness over recognition. He didn't try to justify his past behavior, he acknowledged it honestly, and then he expressed something far more valuable than apology: pride. Hearing those words didn't erase the pain of what he said weeks earlier, but it transformed it. The wound didn't disappear, but it healed with understanding and respect. In that room full of people who might have judged me by my attire, my son's voice redefined my worth, not for them, but for himself. And that mattered more than any validation from strangers ever could. Later that evening, as we walked home in comfortable silence, he asked if I ever regretted my choices. I told him regret is a complex emotion, one that arises when we wish for different outcomes, not different intentions. I explained that I sometimes wondered what life would have been like if I had taken the engineering offer, if I had pursued a higher salary or climbed a corporate ladder. But wondering is not the same as wishing. I told him I never wished for a life without him at the center of it. I told him my choices were guided by love, and although they came with sacrifices, they also gave me moments I never would have traded. Bedtime stories, scraped knees bandaged, birthdays celebrated, heartbreaks comforted. I explained that sacrifice is not synonymous with loss when it is made with purpose. He listened, and for the first time, I felt that he truly heard, not just my words, but the heart behind them. And as we reached home, he said something simple yet profound: "Dad, I'm proud of you." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But it was genuine, and it was enough. In the end, I realized that my journey as a father wasn't about being perfect, wealthy, or impressive. It was about being constant, an anchor in a world that often tells young minds to value image over character. My son's judgment didn't define me, but teaching him the truth reshaped him. I didn't change jobs or buy a new car or transform into someone successful by society's standards. I changed nothing about my life, only the way he saw it. And that was enough to rebuild our bond. Because respect isn't demanded, it's earned. And sometimes, the greatest victories are measured not by applause or achievements, but by the quiet moment when a child looks at a parent with understanding instead of embarrassment, pride instead of shame. And as I sat in my living room that night, watching him do homework with a sense of calm that hadn't been there before, I realized the lesson had come full circle. The truth didn't just show him who I was, it showed him who he could become. Someone who values love over ego, compassion over judgment, and character over image. And in that realization, I felt something deeper than pride. I felt peace. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps more people discover powerful stories about family, sacrifice, and unexpected truth. Join our community for more emotional journeys, jaw-dropping confrontations, and life-changing lessons.